Chapter 13, The Last Years. The year 1875, which saw the departure of the first band of Salesian missionaries, was also that of the establishment of the first Salesian house in France. The congregation already possessed 15 houses in Italy. It was no great distance from the north of Italy to the south of France, and the foundation at Nice, just over the border, was the forerunner of others in the same region. Marseilles and Toulon quickly followed. In 1880, a foundation was made in Spain. This rapid progress occurring towards the end of Don Bosco's life, despite his greatly increased resources in manpower, cost him immense effort and provided him with many trials. He was showing now signs of age and experienced the increasing difficulty of getting about, but it made no difference. In fact, during the last years of his life, he travelled further afield than he had ever done before. The last 15 years or so of his life represent the harvest time of all the years of effort and struggle that preceded them. The Salesian congregation was growing, and some of its growth in the latter years was assisted by the number of subjects who came from his establishment for late vocations, which, founded in 1882, by 1884 already numbered upwards of 140 students. In future years it was to supply the diocesan clergy with many recruits and useful members to the Salesian congregation. So now, in addition to Italy, South America, Spain and France held a special place in Don Bosco's heart. They all had Salesians within their borders. To South America he could not go, but France was within a day's journey from Turin, and the third-class compartment with its wooden seat was comfort enough for one who was accustomed to a hard life. More than once Don Bosco packed his bag and set out for Nice. On such occasions, in 1884, an Irish woman, a Miss Helena Martin, on a visit to Mentone, had heard that he was to pass through en route from Turin to Nice. The train stopped for 10 minutes at Mentone. He kept his journey as private as possible, not liking any fuss to be made about him, she writes. My mother and I went to the station, and I peeped into the carriage till I found him, a nice, gentle-looking priest with 2 young lads, quite poor boys. And fancy my impetuosity. I sprang into the carriage, knelt down and said in French, "Father, I have come for your blessing." He placed his 2 hands on my head and said most fervently, "I bless you with all my heart." He gave me a rosary and a medal, asking me to pray for him and his dear boys. My too short interview with the saint ended, and in a few minutes the train steamed away. He was low-sized, with very tender dark eyes, very simple and kind in manner. The oratory in Nice began in very much the same simple fashion as in Valdocco. Gradually the workshops were started, a printing press set up, and within a very short time upwards of 100 boys were being cared for by the Salesians. This and the foundations made in Toulon and Marseilles were watched over by Don Bosco with a fatherly eye. But in 1883 came the need for a journey through the length and breadth of France. It was in connection with the last of his great building projects, one this time that he undertook and brought to success where others had failed. He had only recently completed his church of St. John the Evangelist in Turin when he was called on to help no less a person than Leo XIII to complete the church in a new and growing quarter of Rome. What happened was this. In 1878, a few months before the death of Pius IX, a plan had been set on foot to build a church dedicated to the Sacred Heart on the Esquiline, where considerable development was taking place, and a church was badly required. After the death of Pius IX, the project was encouraged by Leo XIII. But in spite of this and the great need for a church in the district, contributions were slow in coming in. And after the laying of the foundation on the 17th of August 1879, work came to a standstill for want of means. Put Don Bosco in charge, recommended Cardinal Alimonda to the despondent Pope. He'll see it through to the end. After some hesitation, the Salesian chapter accepted the responsibility, added to the scheme a plan for a technical school next to the church, and Don Bosco went to work. He was faced with the necessity of finding something like £3,000 a month. It might well be imagined that he had already exhausted every known means of raising money for charitable purposes. Yet he set about his new task with a zest that seemed to belie his years and increasing infirmities. He drew up a circular addressed to the episcopate of the whole world and to the editors of all Catholic periodicals, explaining the nature and object of the undertaking. He induced members of the Roman aristocracy to provide granite columns supporting the church. He begged and persuaded others to beg on his behalf. Leo XIII, who had informed him on more than one occasion that he could do little to help him, came generously to his assistance. Still, money was needed all the time, and it did not always arrive in sufficient quantity to prevent work sometimes being suspended for want of it. In 1883, the end of a 4-year period that Don Bosco had imagined would suffice to see the work completed, the roof had only just been put on. He was worried, for he felt now that he had exhausted every source. Then he bethought of France. He would stump the country and appeal to the charity of the French for funds to complete his undertaking. Possibly at the back of his mind was the thought that a Salesian house in Paris would fittingly crown what he increasingly felt was the end of a busy life. He was undaunted by the fact that his tour would coincide with the appeal for the building of the Basilica at Montmartre, that French Catholics were preoccupied over the need to build schools throughout the country as a result of the laws of 1880. When all this was urged upon him by a French Salesian, he evinced his old optimism. How little you know your own country. France is a great country. She has money for every need. She gives unceasingly and untiringly. Say what you like. Despite storms and trials, she remains to those who know her well, and Don Bosco is one of them, generous France. He was undaunted also by the state of his health. He was 68, but on the last half-century he had crowded more activity than is commonly achieved by 2 or more men, and he was now prematurely aged. Then, too, he was very tired. His legs were all but useless to him, and his sight was almost gone. In spite of all these difficulties, he must now, he felt, go to Paris. To Paris he went. Don Bosco's journey through France, which was intended as a begging tour, turned into a triumphal progress. The truth is that in Turin and its neighbourhood he had long been recognized as a holy priest, and his fame had spread abroad, so that the further he travelled away from his own surroundings, the more he found that his reputation, and it was a reputation of sanctity, had preceded him. Leaving Turin on the 31st of January, he went to Nice, where he spent the month of February gathering his strength for the heavy months ahead. Then he set out, and making his way through Marseilles and Avignon, came to Lyon. Everywhere it was the same. Crowds flocked round him, begging his prayers, blessing his advice, the cure of spiritual and physical sickness. When he was staying for a couple of nights in Avignon, he had no sooner arrived than the news was around the town in a flash. People crowded round him wherever he went, and some cut pieces from his cassock. At any rate, he remarked, on observing the damage, I ought to get a new cassock out of it. It was the same at Lyons. Abbé Montmain, the first biographer of St. John Vianney, was reminded forcibly of the scenes at Ars. I thought that I was back there, he wrote. It was at Lyon that Don Bosco gave his famous impromptu lecture on Patagonia to the Geographical Society, providing interesting and original information on the flora and fauna of that region, describing accurately the configuration of the country and the course of the rivers. Some of the information he had obtained, no doubt, from the reports of his Salesians so lately established there, but some at least of the originality and method of presentation were due to a dream he had experienced shortly beforehand. He did not inform his audience of this, but was grateful for the gold medal which they awarded him in recognition of an outstanding occasion. Don Bosco left Lyon for Moulins on the 16th of April. 3 days later he arrived in Paris, where he stayed with friends in the Avenue de Messine. His fame had gone before him, and from the moment of arrival he found his time fully booked. Letters poured in from all sides with requests for prayers, cures, favours of every kind, and interviews. Principally, of course, it was all due to his reputation as a wonder worker, and though doubtless popular journalism had exaggerated his past achievements of this nature, they nevertheless occurred in Paris, incidents which clearly manifest an element of the miraculous and serve to increase popular enthusiasm. 2 remarkable cures of children seriously ill can be quoted in support of this assertion. There was the case of the son of the Marquise de Bouillé, whose father came to enlist Don Bosco's aid for his grandson. Don Bosco reassured him, telling him that the child, though given up by the doctors, would not die. When all his interviews were done, he went straight to the child's bedside, called the family about him, said a short prayer to Our Lady, Help of Christians, and then left the house, telling them all that the child's convalescence would shortly begin. To the doctor's astonishment, it did so next morning. A few days later, a similar incident occurred. Don Bosco was sent for to the bedside of a girl of 11 who was on the point of death. Once more he assembled the family round the dying child and said his prayer to Our Lady, asking for the child's cure. He then left the house, remarking as he did so, "Leave her quiet now, let her rest." His advice was carefully followed, and the next morning the girl was completely cured. Reports of these and similar occurrences in the press increased the crowds thronging round Don Bosco. The Liberté, 5th of April, reported as follows of the scenes outside the house in the Avenue de Messine. Several carriages stand before the door. In the courtyard, numerous visitors come and go. The concierge is busy taking names and booking appointments. In the drawing room, which is spacious, there is no seat unoccupied. Those who have obtained an appointment for some time during the day wait there. Much of the same picture is painted by the universe. For the past week, the religious world has talked of nothing but Don Bosco and his oratory. The Italian St. Vincent de Paul is now spending a few days in Paris. Long lines of carriages have been standing before the house where he is staying a full week. The highest ladies in society are begging Don Bosco for miracles for themselves or for their relations, and it is said he works them easily. On his arrival in Paris, he had been told by Cardinal Sheppard that he must preach in the Madeleine. Preach in the Madeleine? You will see how generous they are. I shouldn't dare, replied Don Bosco. My French is too poor. No, no, insisted the Cardinal. You must speak. Paris will listen only to you. The sermon at the Madeleine, which took place on the 19th of April, was a great success. Indeed, it was something of a miracle. The church was crowded to such an extent that Don Bosco had a difficulty in reaching the pulpit. By any ordinary standard, the sermon he gave that Sunday afternoon to a distinguished audience might well be termed ineffective, for his French was faltering, and owing to his fatigue, his delivery unimpressive. His sight, which was failing, prevented him seeing his audience clearly, and he peered at them in a way that did not exactly enhance the impression produced by his somewhat poor appearance. Many could not hear him, and those who did so frequently lost the thread of his remarks, owing to his insecure command of the language. Yet this congregation, accustomed to the best French pulpit oratory, was deeply impressed and showed us generosity and appreciation by subscribing £400 on the spot. On the 2nd of May, similar scenes of devotion and generosity were repeated in Saint-Sulpice, where Don Bosco had agreed to say the 9 o'clock Mass. By 8, the vast nave and the side aisles were full. Don Bosco arrived an hour and a half late. He had left the Avenue de Messine at 7:30 a.m. and visited several sick people, and time had run on. After the Gospel, he said a few words from the steps of the altar. He was distributing communion for half an hour. At the end of Mass, his way back to the sacristy was barred by an immense crowd, all clamouring for his blessing, for him to touch rosaries, pictures. Here, once more, pieces were cut from his cassock. People climbed over the chairs or onto them in order to see him. 4 young curates and the beadle, who had been told off to protect him from the crowd, were quite powerless. At last, just before midday, he managed to get to the sacristy, and the door was closed behind him. It was at Saint-Sulpice, the seminary this time, not the parish church, that Don Bosco made history in another way. He had been asked to give a short conference to the seminarists, and on account of the many who were clamouring for an interview, the sick that he had to call upon, and all the various demands upon his time, arrived at the seminary 3/4 of an hour late. Director, as the professors at Saint-Sulpice were called, was stamping about, muttering, "Communities wait for no one," while one of the students turned to account the period of unexpected liberty by composing the following lines. Don Bosco, nous dit-on, a fait des grands miracles, ressuscité des morts et rendu des oracles. Mais le plus grand miracle, celui d'aujourd'hui, ta règle à Saint-Sulpice a fléchi devant lui. Or, Don Bosco, it is said, has worked great miracles, raised the dead, and spoken as an oracle. But the greatest miracle of all is today's your rule Saint-Sulpice has given way before him. In the early days of May, Don Bosco preached in various Parisian churches, where on each occasion the same scenes of enthusiasm were repeated. At Saint-Pierre-du-Gros-Caillou, he was somewhat disconcerted on arrival in the pulpit to see Cardinal Lavigerie sitting in the pew immediately behind him. Don Bosco, in his own brand of French, in which an attractive simplicity was mingled with occasional elementary mistakes of grammar and syntax, described his work for youth in Turin and elsewhere, and the need for the opening in the heart of Paris a Salesian establishment worthy of the capital city of France. When he had finished, Cardinal Lavigerie rose in his place and lent his voice and eloquence in recommendation of Don Bosco and his work. It was typical effort of the kind of charity sermon at which Lavigerie was past master, and appeal to the combined motives of religion and patriotism in a polished French which contrasted vividly with what had gone before. Paris was generous to Don Bosco, and in spite of the many calls on his charity that were just being made, he collected something like £16,000 during his stay in the capital. Some of the money went to the church that he was responsible for in Rome, some to his other charities. The balance was used for the foundation of the Salesian house that 2 years later was established at Ménilmontant. After Paris, Lille and Amiens saw him, everywhere the same scenes were repeated. He was always surrounded by crowds. In church, people stood on the chairs to see him. Wherever he went, he could be heard to exclaim, "C'est la sainte, c'est la sainte." And again, pieces were lopped off his cassock. He bore it all humbly and good-humouredly, exclaiming once or twice, all right, so all the madmen aren't at Charenton, French equivalent of Colony Hatch. He gave away innumerable rosaries and medals, and what seems more surprising, little pictures of himself. But he never shrank from modern publicity methods, remarking once that the devil made use of them with some success for all sorts of dubious undertakings, and that it behoved his opponents to use modern weapons to fight in a good cause. He could show a certain wit on occasion. Thus, a woman who pestered him to sign her autograph book, declaring, "Father, I'm not going away until you have given me your autograph," found this unequivocal statement staring at her in Don Bosco's angular script from the hitherto blank page. "Received from Madame X the sum of 2,000 francs for my very charitable works, Don Bosco." He left Paris on his way back to Turin on the 26th of May, but hardly was he home than he was obliged to leave again, this time for Frosdorf, a 2 days' journey where the Comte de Chambord was asking for his help. Don Bosco was categoric that de Chambord would never reign over France, but he seems to have effected a temporary improvement in his health, though in view of his mysterious death a few weeks later, it is difficult to state this with any certainty. Don Bosco was quite worn out and was manifestly aging rapidly. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1886, he managed to find the strength to visit the Salesians in Spain, travelling by way of Nice, Toulon, Marseilles and Montpellier to Barcelona. Once again were repeated the enthusiastic scenes of his tour in France 3 years previously. Once again, too, Don Bosco appears to have wrought miracles. To the discerning observer, it was obvious that his strength was failing. When he went to France, he undertook a journey that many considered would be too much for him, and on his visit to Barcelona, it seemed that he was at the end of his resources of physical energy. 2 years previously, in the autumn of 1884, the Pope had taken steps to relieve him of some of the cares of the government. Colonel Jacobini wrote to the Archbishop of Turin, Cardinal Alimonda, asking him to ascertain Don Bosco's views concerning the future government of the Salesians. The Holy Father, wrote Cardinal Jacobini, sees Don Bosco's health deteriorating from day to day. He fears for the future of the oratory. Would your Eminence, with all the tact required by such a step, approach him to designate the religious who, in case of need, would be worthy of taking his place, or of now undertaking the office of Vicar General with the right of succession? The Holy Father reserves to himself the right of deciding between these alternatives, but strongly desires your Eminence to fulfill this mission at once, as it touches the best interests of the oratory. On October the 24th, 1884, Don Bosco informed the chapter of the Archbishop's démarche and announced that he had decided to select Don Rua for that office. The matter was considered in Rome, and finally Don Rua was appointed. Henceforth, wrote Don Bosco in a circular letter to the congregation, he will take my place in the full and entire exercise of the government of the congregation. At the same time as the announcement from Rome confirming Don Rua's appointment came the news of Don Caliero's appointment as Vicar Apostolic of Northern and Central Patagonia. This first episcopal appointment from among his Salesians gave great joy to their founder, though it can hardly have come as a surprise, in view of what had already been related regarding Don Bosco's foreknowledge of the event. He had spoken of it many years before it happened. Largely by Don Bosco's efforts, the Church of the Sacred Heart in Rome was brought to completion, and on the 14th of May, 1887, it was consecrated. 2 days later, Don Bosco said Mass in the church at the altar of Our Lady Help of Christians. Upwards of 15 times during the Mass he paused, and was several times observed to be in tears. He was obviously very deeply moved. After Mass, his secretary, Don Vietti, asked him what had happened. "You did nothing but weep," he remarked. "It was because throughout the Mass," replied Don Bosco, "the dream I had as a boy of 9 was vividly present to my mind." You know of that dream which determined my whole life? The wicked little urchins sinning against God, their turning into wild beasts, then their transformation into gentle little lambs, the divine shepherdess and her counsels of kindness and gentleness. Again, I remember telling my mother and brothers of that dream next day, and the questions that they asked me. One sentence above the rest continually rang in my ears, that uttered by the shepherdess when I urged her to give me the key to the dream. "One day, in due time, you will understand." That was 62 years ago. Now I understand.